Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. In the previous part of this presentation, I discussed ways in which you could support human life extension and the attainment of eventual indefinite longevity for human beings. This time, however, I am going to talk about one course of action that you should never, in any circumstances, take for the pursuit of human life extension. And this course of action is asking for even a penny of government funding to support this cause. Now, of course, I am one of the most avid supporters of human life extension. I want it to progress as quickly as possible, and I want it to save as many lives as possible. And it is for this reason precisely that I staunchly and categorically oppose the government funding it. Now, let's have an analogy to compare this issue to, and it's actually a quite closely related example, the example of stem cell research. Now, I also believe that stem cell research is a wonderful endeavor, that it should be continued, and that its scope should be expanded. And it is precisely for this purpose that I do not want the government funding it. Because what happens when the government gives money to any particular initiative? The government never just gives money and says, here, you can do with this whatever you want, however it pleases you. No, there are always strings attached. And these strings are much stronger than if a private organization gives money, because the government is an inherently coercive entity. It has the backing of legal force behind all of its requirements. So if you don't do what the government says, the government could fine you or even shut you down and punish you personally. So with stem cell research, we have seen what great problems government funding of it has run into. Because under the Bush administration, with bioethicists in place such as Leon Kass, who is strongly opposed to not only indefinite human longevity, but any kind of treatment, any kind of medical progress or experimentation that he believes is contrary to his vision of human nature and that he believes would amount to playing God. So severe restrictions have been placed on federally funded stem cell research by the Bush administration. And because so many scientists, virtually all of them, have fallen for the trap of federal funding, hampering federally funded stem cell research and the possibilities of what can be done with it, in effect, hampers virtually all stem cell research. Hence, stem cell therapies have not been marketed or developed as quickly as they could have been. Now, if a few smart scientists or scientific organizations decided to reject federal funding at the onset, then they couldn't be regulated nearly to the same extent. If you don't accept federal funding, there might still be some blanket laws that apply to you, but most of the conditions that the federal government stipulates are a direct result of the money that it distributes. And this is the same on all levels of government in virtually all countries. You cannot have a government that gives you money with no strings attached. So, moreover, why is it wrong to solicit government funding? If you solicit government funding and if you receive it, opponents of indefinite human longevity might actually have a legitimate case to restrict and regulate it, because, they would argue, it is their tax money that is being used to fund a purpose with which they disagree. And just as you wouldn't want your tax money used to fund a purpose with which you disagree, no matter how good objectively that purpose might be, they would argue the same from their own standpoint. So this would greatly limit your ability to argue legitimately for why human life extension should be pursued. Other people will just say, okay, pursue it, but not with our money, and because the government is taking our money to give it to you, if the government is going to do this, at least you're going to have to accept some very severe restrictions on the kinds of research and the kinds of treatments in which you will be allowed to engage. So this could stifle and ultimately destroy the whole longevity project altogether if these anti-indefinite life extension groups form a powerful enough lobby and say, you can't do this with our constituents' tax money. And furthermore, whenever the government funds a particular enterprise, be it the interstate highway system in the late 1950s or the space program in the 1950s and 1960s, what happens is there may be an initial burst of innovation as the government invests large amounts of capital in infrastructure. But then there's inevitably stagnation because the government bureaucracies are not faced with competition. They're not faced with nearly the same incentives to innovate or to save costs as private entities. So they typically build up infrastructure that may be pretty good for the time period in which it was established, just like the interstate highway system was pretty good for the 1950s. The moon launches were pretty good for the late 1960s and early 1970s, but we've noticed no substantial improvements in the American network of transportation since the 1950s, and we've noticed very few improvements in the US space program since the 1970s, since the moon missions were abandoned. And only now are we seeing a renaissance of space flight and space travel, with private companies finally taking over as NASA is recognizing the futility of continuing its monopoly on space exploration. So, as we can see, accepting government funds for extending human longevity will defeat the project of extending human longevity. The government will impose strings. Interest groups that oppose longevity will actually have legitimate reasons to restrict research and treatments, and while there may be an initial burst of innovation, the whole field of human life extension would stagnate if the government were to fund it to any substantial degree. So be very careful what you ask for. Solicit money only from private individuals, and only when you are fully aware of the conditions and are able to proceed with the ultimate objective, which is human life extension, irrespective of what other people think.